Welcome to BookDrop, Black Lives Then and Now. Now, BookDrop is a monthly series of themed discussions around Black culture and the African diaspora, and it centers around books and resources that are available online and through your public library, specifically the Lansdowne Library. Now, today, as we enter into Black History Month, we want to take a moment to reflect on the life of Martin Luther King Jr. Now, we just celebrated his National Day of Observance, and so in a way, he's still really fresh in our minds. Now, most years we honor his legacy by watching a few videos of him standing at the lectern at the National Mall, and we trot out a few choice lines from his I Have a Dream speech. But Martin Luther King Jr. was so much deeper and so much more complex than the sound bites that we usually give him. And his words are so much richer and so much more relevant and much more diverse than the speech that he gave at the March on Washington that fateful day in 1963. So, where do we start? Well, the very first thing we should do is we should start with what Martin Luther King Jr. wrote. Now, for the uninitiated, one thing I would probably do is I would probably start with some of his shorter text. One thing we don't give Martin Luther King a lot of credit for is the fact that he has always been a writer. So, one thing I would probably start with is something that he wrote long before the March on Washington. And this piece is especially good for students. Way back in 1947, when Martin Luther King was only 17, 18 years old, he was a student at Morehouse College. Now, Morehouse College is a historically Black college and university, only for men, and he wrote an article for his newspaper, for the student newspaper. And that article was called The Purpose of Education. Now, in this article, it's not very long, it's pretty short. We get a chance to see how Martin Luther King Jr. looked at the purpose of education and how education in America is often impacted by notions of race, and how education isn't about just attainment, not just attainment of degrees or attainment of wealth, but education should be about something more. Education should be about moral character as well. And so, even as a 17 or 18-year-old, we get a sense of who Martin Luther King Jr. was. Now, that isn't necessarily a shadow of the man that he would become, but it was definitely an indication of the kind of thinker and the kind of man he was, right? So, if you haven't been introduced to Martin Luther King Jr., then taking a look at his college essay, The Purpose of Education, is a nice start. All right, so where else can we go? I'd probably fast forward, again for the uninitiated, to look at a moment that many of us have talked about, but not many of us have seen. I would take a look at Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. Now, I think that his speech at the National Mall in 1963 is probably his most famous piece. But I think one of his more significant pieces is this letter from a Birmingham jail because you really get a sense of the full spectrum of King's thoughts. And you also get a more accurate glimpse of who he was in the civil rights movement. Yes, he was a great leader, but he wasn't always the person standing at a podium where people were cheering for him. Oftentimes, he was hated, he was maligned, he was criticized, not just by racists who wanted to keep segregation going, but also by the people that he would consider some of his closest comrades in this fight for justice. So when he writes the letter from Birmingham jail, he is explaining his position on nonviolence. He's also explaining why it's so important that the freedom struggle continue in both the streets and through legal means. His letter is actually targeted, not again, not to segregationists, but it's targeted to other people who are working towards civil rights who refuse to get involved in demonstrations such as sit-ins and direct action. He's writing the letter to other clergy who have decided that The work for social justice and civil rights isn't the work of the church. And Martin Luther King says, no, no, this is exactly where we've been called to be. You know, the story of the letter from the Birmingham jail is interesting too. You know, when Martin Luther King Jr. was writing it, he was sitting in prison. And so he had to take little scribbled bits of newspaper and toilet paper that were smuggled into him. And that's what he wrote this letter on. So think about this. Martin Luther King, yes, the man that was standing at the podium, was in jail. He had been put in jail for protest. And he wrote this letter sitting in jail on scraps of toilet paper, and that became this letter. Just the story alone makes it a significant piece. So please, please, please go ahead and read that. Now, some of you might be wondering, all right, all right, where can I get these things? Well, one of the wonderful things is the article that Martin Luther King Jr. wrote when he was 17 or 18 and the letter from the Birmingham jail are both readily available online, free of cost from lots of different searches, lots of different sources. You don't have to do anything but Google it and you can find it, right? But let's talk about some of the other things that Martin Luther King Jr. wrote, right? He actually wrote more than speeches. He wrote several books. So let's take a look at some of those. Well, one book that he wrote is called Stride Toward Freedom. The other one that he wrote is called Strength to Love. The other two, and these are the two that I want to focus on today, and I would highly recommend them, Why We Can't Wait, and also the book that I have here, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. And I think these two books, Where Do We Go From Here and Why We Can't Wait, are incredibly important because I think to me, these books really crystallize Martin Luther King Jr.'s political thought, both in this country and abroad. You know, Martin Luther King Jr. doesn't get enough credit for his understanding of African history and the role that African Americans play in the African diaspora. You know, I don't know if he would take on the title of or the term Pan Africanist in a way, but that's exactly who he expresses himself to be in terms of his belief that the lives of African people all over the world are connected and need to be even more connected in our strivings toward both political, economic, and social equality and self sufficiency. And we get that in this book. So, this is a great one. So, this book, Where Do We Go From Here? And also Why We Can't Wait are both available here at the Lansdowne Library. So, what are some other things that we can do to explore Dr. Martin Luther King more readily? Well, in addition to reading the things that he wrote, we can also read things about him that might go a little bit deeper than the tried and true things that we usually see. So, we can find all kinds of biographies about Martin Luther King Jr. Here's one for young people that I particularly like, Martin Luther King Jr., Warrior for Peace by Tanya Savory. And this book is a short biography of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. This was written primarily for middle school and high school students. But again, it's still a really great introduction into the life of Martin Luther King Jr. Now, speaking of biographies, there have been some incredible biographies written about Martin Luther King Jr. One of the ones that our local library has, and unfortunately, I don't have it here with me because I would love to show it to you, is a fabulous historian, biographer, Taylor Branch, who wrote Parting the Waters, America in the King Years. And this is a widely, widely expansive biography about Martin Luther King. I've read other biographies about Martin Luther King, and they are very good. But I think I would probably start with that one because it just gives a really strong overarching view. And Taylor Branch's writing style, in my humble opinion, is one that's really accessible to a lot of different readers. So biographies are a great place to start. There are some other books that I want to show you too. Sometimes we get a canned view of our heroes, right? And what I mean by a canned view is that oftentimes we'll get a glimpse of the public facing individual. So for King, we always get a glimpse of who he was on stage, who he was speaking, who he was in front of a podium or in front of the cameras or in front of the microphone. And that's important. But one of the things that I like about biographies is that they often give us an inside glimpse into the life behind the camera. You know, what their home lives were like, what their relationships were with their friends and their colleagues. Because we know that the civil rights movement wasn't about one man. We know that it was about incredible, dozens and dozens, and hundreds of people who interacted with one another that had personal relationships. And I like getting that from biographies. But I feel like this book by Michael Eric Dyson, I May Not Get There With You, The True Martin Luther King Jr., does something really interesting. Like, I feel like this book shows a glimpse of Martin Luther King from behind the camera. In each chapter, it examines different aspects of his life without the veneer of celebrity, without holding him on the pedestal that we oftentimes put him on. You know, he's revered for many reasons, and a lot of those reasons are well founded and they're good. But sometimes the things that are most instructive for some of us during some times are the mistakes, are the failings, are the weaknesses. And I feel like Michael Eric Dyson's book does something important. It uses the mistakes of King or the flaws in King as teachable moments for us. You know, it's not that the book knocks him off of his pedestal. What it does is it humanizes King in a way that we oftentimes don't get when we only spend time with him one day in January. So I would recommend this book. You know, I May Not Get There With You by Michael Eric Dyson. It's a really interesting look at Martin Luther King. All right. Now, I don't want to leave some of our more visual learners and some of our younger learners out of the equation. All right. So let's take a look at a couple of other books that are geared towards the visual. Now, library oftentimes has collections like this, and there'll be picture histories. Sometimes there'll be large coffee books, but I really like this one. Now, the title is a little bit misleading. It says The Day Martin Luther King Jr. Was Shot, a photo history of the civil rights movement. And the reason why I say that it's misleading is because the title seems to indicate that it's going to talk about that unfortunate day in Memphis when Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. But in reality, this book actually talks about the entire history of racial injustice in America and how that history of racial injustice leads to that moment when Martin Luther King Jr. was shot. So he talks about slavery, talks about the African American church, discusses the movement for abolition and freedom of slaves, talks about the Underground Railroad, and it connects all those events through Reconstruction all the way up to the Civil Rights Movement. Uh, Profiles direct action like the sit-ins that started in Greensboro, North Carolina, and it even has some iconic images of civil rights. Medgar Evers there that you see sitting there. He was field secretary for the NAACP and he was killed in Jackson, Mississippi. We also have a famous photo of a young man who was attacked by dogs one fateful day in Birmingham, Alabama. And this story, we got to have a talk about this story here because the gentleman that you see there in this picture is only a teenager. I believe he was only 16 years old in this photo. I can't wait to talk about that one. Anyway, these picture histories can be really, really useful. So, one thing that I've always found to be good for picture histories is to go ahead and take a look at what it covers. Don't just allow the cover of the book to, or the title, to dictate what's going to be in there. Sometimes you have to glance because it's really interesting to see how King is situated in the moment with the actual pictures there. So, what else? Well, when it comes to our young readers, I think it's really important that we don't trade in just the stories that they already know. And what I mean by that is we'll oftentimes find books like this one, What Was the March on Washington, that feature Martin Luther King. But sometimes these books, and I'm not using this as an example of one of the books that does this, but sometimes the books only give us where he was born, a few things that he did, and why that was good, which is interesting. But one of the things that we want to try to do is contextualize more. You know, most of us don't even know that the famous March on Washington in 1963 wasn't just called the March on Washington. It was really called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And that's an aspect of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life that we oftentimes don't give as much attention to. The fact that as much as he made a mark in America for um, encouraging integration and social equity, he was also incredibly concerned with making sure that the poor in America, not just Black people, but the poor in America, were able to have equal rights under the law and equal opportunities. You know, the night before he was killed, remember, he was having a conversation with sanitation workers in Memphis looking for justice. So this book, even though it says the March on Washington, not the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, is actually pretty good. It's What Was the March on Washington by Kathleen Cole. And again, it does a pretty good job in very clear language describing the civil rights movement and some other significant figures in it. This was actually one of the first books that my first two children, and they're 13 and 11 now, but I think when they were probably 5 and 7, this was one of the first books that we read to them. So I like this book. I appreciate it, especially for younger readers who you want to introduce the movement to. But the book I really like, right? One of the books that I really, really like is this one. Let me scoot out a little bit. It's Memphis, Martin, and the Mountaintop, the sanitation strike of 1968. Again, the story that mostly gets told is the story of Martin Luther King leading the fight for um, racial equality through the sit ins and through integration. And it culminates with the March on Washington in 1963. But Martin Luther King Jr.'s life continued on after that. And his perspective on the things that were going to grant people justice shifted and matured some. And I love this children's book, Memphis, Martin, and the Mountaintop, The Sanitation Strike of 1968 by Alice Faye Duncan. I love this book because it focuses on the latter years of his life and how his attention turned to economic justice and also self-reliance and um, self-economic attainment. So this book is beautifully illustrated, and it's illustrated by R. Gregory Christie, and it's beautifully illustrated, and it's a perfect book for young readers. And it's situated in Memphis. It talks about what sanitation workers would do. It talks about their working conditions, how they weren't uh, paid. It gives names. It talks about who the mayor was. It talks about what some of the difficulties in organizing a sanitation strike were. It's a beautiful book. And the reason um, why it's such an important book is because it gives context for a movement that we often ignore, but many would argue it's the movement that got Martin Luther King Jr. killed. Right? So I really, really like this book. It tells the rest of the story for the life of Martin Luther King. And I think it's really important for young people to hear. Oftentimes when we tell the rest of the story, we end up finding more connections to our current day situations than just the usual conversations around the I Have a Dream speech, right? Now, some of you might be saying, well, that book is great, but what if I have some older readers? Um, I have a reader, teenager, and my teenager might not be ready to really process all that's going on in Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And they're not going to sit down and read a 500-page biography by Taylor Branch. I understand. And I got you. Here's an interesting book. Ah, I love the innovative approach of Nick Stone's Dear Martin. So, Dear Martin is a book that centers around a character named Justice. And Justice is wrestling with some of the ideas of Dr. Martin Luther King. And so his approach to him wrestling with Martin Luther King's ideas is to journal to Martin Luther King Jr. So throughout the book, we hear about Justice's story. We understand some of his trepidations and worries, and we get his growing understanding of who Martin Luther King Jr. was and his understanding of some of the words that he spoke through him journaling. And I just love the premise of the book. I love the approach. This is a great book for middle school students. It's a great book for high school students that need a little bit more motivation to figure out, well, how does this stuff that happened, 40, 50 years ago, how does this stuff align, or how is it significant for me? So another great choice is Dear Martin by Nick Stone. All right. This book is a winner. Right. I'd love to have a book group of young people to read this. Plug. All right, everyone. So those are some of the selections that I have. Your local library, especially the local library here in Lansdowne, have a ton of great choices, and these are just a few. But hopefully, as we spend more time together, I'll be able to introduce you to even more books, and you'll come and find some for yourself. So, love having this opportunity. Enjoyed the conversation, and hopefully, you can come and get more resources and more books right here at the Book Drop, where we drop resources, we drop knowledge, and have great conversations. See you soon.